Every painting has its humble beginnings. Whether it has lots of sheep, very detailed grass, or just the impression of some. There could be just one tree or hundreds. That's why I never underestimate the importance of a very good underpainting. It's very crucial for helping you set up your composition with simple, basic shapes, lines, and color. I started the painting with a simple grid, nothing out of the ordinary, just 6 lines that equaled 16 squares. The idea in the beginning is just to get the big bodies of color and line work that will build up the composition. Nothing too detailed, but at the same time, accuracy was very important for me. The idea was for people that were familiar with the village to be able to recognize each hill and field, including a few trees as well. It is very important to note that the first few layers are going to be very thin, especially since I'm going to go back and build on top of them. And I'm not trying to be super accurate, more like placing things where they seem like they're going to be, and later refining those shapes and colors and sculpting sheep, fields, and trees from them, even though they look like smudges of paint at the start. When I began painting the foreground, surprisingly, I painted the bodies of grass along where the sheep were going to be before I started painting the sheep themselves, in a way like an outline. Then I started painting some of the bodies of the sheep. I didn't do much, except for I applied lights and darks. There were countless sheep, and this was something that I knew was going to be challenging from the start. But the goal at the beginning was just to get the composition right and place each sheep where they belonged. I used a series of lines and shapes of color to establish their location. Again, not too detailed, and the layers of paint were thin because later I will definitely go back and build on top and refine each shape to the sheep they would become. And some of the sheep had slightly different tones. Some were pretty white, others were actually on the tanner side, and there were 2 peculiar ones that were on the darker brown, especially the pack leader here. I knew when I started painting him, he was going to be very important later since he makes eye contact with the viewer. Just like the fields, I didn't go into too much detail when painting the sheep. I just applied simple shapes and lines of where the bodies and heads and legs would be. And later, of course, I will go back and detail them. But I made sure I gave them a sense of volume so they don't appear like cutouts in the painting. When painting the background, even though I didn't want to go into too much detail, I wanted to paint key features, especially specific things in the fields that stood out, like discolorations, some of the mountains in the back, and I also wanted to start planting some of the trees. Again, not too much detail, but more as place markers, so when I go back into the painting, I can build up from what I have. But the place markers are very important. In a way, they act as guides that will help me later when I start building the detail. Though I'm constantly emphasizing detail for the background, it is very important to note that it is not sharp detail. It's going to be more of a blurry detail. Think of it this way. I still want the background to recede and be pushed back to give the viewer a sense of depth and distance. So I'm only going to be able to achieve that by doing key tricks of illusionism, such as soft edges and lines, lower contrast, and also lighter tones. I'll save the bright, high contrast, sharp things for the front. Check out my video on how to paint very detailed grass if you want an idea of how I treat grass up close versus in the distance. Besides wanting people familiar with the area to be able to recognize the hills, I found it very interesting a while back that my father was able to spot a certain field that he used to own in one of the smaller paintings I've done in the past. Therefore, the goal was not to overlook any details that would be able to make each field identifiable to each owner, such as tree count, plus a different kind of plants that I'm not familiar with, but they grow and can tell from a distance that this is their field from just looking at my painting. Even though I mentioned I'm not trying to create too much detail at the beginning, I began to experiment with the field. I knew this was actually going to be a little bit challenging because there's lots of plants. They're also planted in orderly fashion in straight lines in some ways. So I had to pull off somehow an illusion of many plants out in the fields. So I started fooling around with pattern. I was just trying to get a little taste of what I will do later. And since this was just the underpainting, I wasn't too worried about making a mistake or two. If anything, this was actually a learning process for me. And later on, I felt like I perfected creating an illusion of fields in the distance. But the key thing in the beginning, like before, it's just to get the fields in the right place, as well as the right colors, and key details that will act like guides later to help me finish the painting. A tip on how to do fields in the distance is the variations of different colors. They are not going to be a solid green. There's going to be lots of different variations of lights and darks, and also the rows of plants. They're not going to be perfect. There are going to be some that are going to be off by a little bit, some a little wider, some a little bit thinner. You have to try to capture these imperfections to pull off the illusion and make it more believable. In a way, these imperfections and rows of different plants, plus all the lights and darks that help define the fields, it's like trying to capture the texture of the earth at a large scale. But since this is the background, and you're trying to paint what's in the distance, you got to use a soft touch with lots of blurry, soft edges, and nothing too sharp, but just enough definition where you give the illusion that there are lots and lots of crops and plants out there. Besides the background, there's also the middle ground that I began to paint. There's not a lot of things in the middle ground. I have to increase the amount of detail to help pull off the illusion of depth and distance. For example, this tree, in the distance you wouldn't be able to see much of it. It would be more of like a blur with the impression of branches and leaves. But since this is a lot closer in the viewing plane, there would be individual branches and leaves visible. But once again, since this is the underpainting, I'm just plotting where it goes right now, and the detail will come later. But at the same time, I am painting some key details as place markers. Again, just to act as guides for later, such as clusters of leaves. Another very important thing I tried to capture in the middle ground is a fence. Yes, there is a fence, and it's actually barely visible in the final painting. But it all started off by planting the poles first, and some of the bushes, and later I actually did the meshing. More on that in a future video. Something I like to do in my paintings is capture detail that people would normally ignore. For example, here in this corner there are actual pallets that are lined up as fences. And since this is kind of in the middle ground and hidden in the shade of the trees, I'm only going to give the impression that there's pallets there and not go too much into detail. One of the key techniques I used early on to build the fields was to lay out colors in lines that shaped the hills in the background. This was very important to establish a sense of the curvature of the land. After laying out the colors, I would actually go back with a dry brush to soften the edges. This is the background after all, and I am trying to establish the sense of distance, but the blurry lines help establish the contours of the landscape and a sense of perspective too, especially the direction of those lines. And even the slightest dips and bends help give the viewer an idea of how the landscape is shaped. Of course, lights and shadows will also help establish this, but the lines also help as well. Besides fields with lots of lush plants, there were a few that barely had any. So in a way, I painted dirt too. I painted them just like every other field. I applied the different colors I saw and then softened the edges. And much later in the painting, I will go into detail. There were lots and lots of trees in this painting. Of course, there's the obvious big one that's up close in the middle ground, but in the distance there were a heck of a lot more. and I treated them all differently based on where they were in the picture plane. The further out they were, they would have less detail and be softer and more blurry. The hardest ones to capture were the ones that were behind the hills. They were clustered together, and honestly, I felt like I had to repaint that area multiple times. The trouble I had was trying to establish a sense of definition among them, but not overdo it because I did want them to recede in the background. So in a way, it was a balancing act of detail and blurriness. I'll be honest, I did not capture them accurately, but I did want a sense of light because this is an area that the sun was hitting directly. Here I'm starting to paint again the middle ground. Some notable things that I'm trying to capture are the bushes, but there's also some twigs that stand out. Also, since this is a little closer in the viewing plane, I'm starting to paint the impression of some leaves. Not too detailed, but some dabs of paint here and there. But the goal is to use lights and darks as well as color to establish the volume of those bushes. I also started to define the ground in front of those bushes and even started to paint individual grass blades that were in front of them. Not too detailed, but just enough to have an idea of the border between the grass and the bushes. And because I know I will paint a fence later, I started also to experiment with a smaller one in this area. I'm not too sure what it is in the photo, but I think it's a little cage. Again, I just experimented to have an idea of how to approach a bigger section later on. Besides that cage-like structure, there also appears to be a little tree there as well. So I started to define the branches with lights and darks. Once again, these little details are very important for me because once again, I'm trying to represent a section of my village as accurately as possible. And I feel even the most minute details such as these will make all the difference in the very end. I wanted to recreate a moment I had in life where I saw this amazing light, and by accurately painting this area will help me in a way relive that moment. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I'll be honest, you don't have to do an underpainting. You could just do a full-blown drawing first. But I like to consider myself a painter and just go straight to painting. That is why I make sure I do a very good underpainting that has the composition laid out nicely for me prior into going into lots of detail. Once again, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob. I'm not your typical painter. Stay tuned for more. I have other sections of my painting that I'm going to break down. So until next time, bye.